Hi there, and welcome to Israel Explained. Yuli Edelstein seems to be ruling the country edition. What's going on? Everyone keeps asking me about the draft law and what's happening with that. So, as we know, a couple of days ago, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that everyone in the country needs to serve in the military. The ruling was aimed at Haredi men. There's no law exempting them. There have been all kinds of executive measures, temporary ones, stopping them from serving. And Supreme Court finally said, enough is enough. That's not the law of the land. Everyone needs to serve. So, in order to counter this, the government needs to pass a law that will um, allow permanent exemptions for Haredi men or anyone else in a way that would be protected from Supreme Court decisions. The task for creating that law was given to Yuli Edelstein, who runs the Knesset Committee for Foreign Policy and Security. And Edelstein was chosen because he's generally loyal to Netanyahu, or at least used to be, has a very good reputation, at least by Likud standards, and enjoys a good rapport with members of the opposition. So it was believed that he could maybe bring in some votes from the opposition, and that's especially important because Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, said that he wants as wide a consensus around this as possible. And he feels so strongly about that that he even voted against the first reading of the law. But the day after the Supreme Court decided what they decided, Edelstein dropped a massive bomb on the political system. He said he's not going to allow any law to pass unless there's a wide consensus either, adopting the position of Yoav Gallant. And that means, theoretically, he's looking for a law that will be acceptable to the Haredi parties and to the opposition. And as everyone knows, there is no such thing. There's absolutely no way that will happen. The Haredi parties want a very watered down law, one that will in practice see fewer people go into the military than do now, or at best around the same. There's around 1,000 going in now. Haredi parties don't want to see any more than that. Meanwhile, the opposition wants to see um, a much wider draft that will eventually lead to equality in the burden of serving in the military. Edelstein explained that he's doing this because, quote, our mission is to minimize the fracture in Israeli society and not expand it. Netanyahu answered this the way he usually does by sending his attack dogs from the Likud after Edelstein. They accused him of working with the opposition, of working with Gallant, which I don't know, doesn't sound so bad to me. He's the defense minister and the minister in the Likud, and generally trying to undermine Netanyahu and bring about elections. Edelstein warned Netanyahu that if he keeps attacking, there will be consequences. Didn't stop Netanyahu from doing it, and there were indeed consequences. There's another law, a very unpopular one, that was supposed to be promoted out of the committee to a second vote in the next few days. And that's the vote raising the age of reserve duty eligibility from 40 to 41 for regular soldiers and from 45 to 46 for officers. Edelstein basically killed that law and said he will not put it up for a second vote. He said there's no way this will pass on the bayonets of the coalition, and then I will hear in the Knesset that the coalition is based on the desires of draft dodgers. End quote. It's very interesting to use what the coalition will say and how it will criticize you as a reason not to promote a law, because as we all know, the coalition will always criticize you no matter what you do. The opposition will always criticize you no matter what you do. That's their job. Um, but the fact that it will not pass has some beneficial effects for 7,000 reserve soldiers who now won't have to serve another year. Will now be able to go back to their families, go back to their business, and go back to their lives after having had to fight at a pretty advanced age, around my age, having to fight in Gaza with children and all that is not easy. The law was unpopular to say the least, so very few people are sad to see it go. But most Israelis feel right now, basically every Israeli outside the Haredi parties, with very few exceptions, feels that Haredi men need to take more responsibility in the military and everyone else needs to take less responsibility in the military. And I think that is definitely fair. Um, when asked about it, Edelstein and the people around him say this isn't a rebellion. It's not a political rebellion. We're not trying to bring about elections. He says it's simply a reflection of the situation in the coalition. He says that right now passing a law that's acceptable to the Likud and the Haredi parties is impossible, and that's true. The Haredi parties want, as I said, very few people to go into the military. The Likud, just about everyone in the Likud wants more people to go into the military. What they differ on is whether they're willing to bow down to the desires of the Haredi party, which is probably most Likud members, but there's an increasingly large bloc that's just not willing to do that. At this point, from what I'm counting, there's about 10 Likud members of Knesset. It's spread from Gallant, Edelstein, Saada, Gottlieb, Shikli, few others, Nir Barkat, that aren't willing to go with this law. And it's impossible, it seems, to harmonize those desires. Now, you may be wondering where the Likud members of Knesset all of a sudden grew a spine from. And the answer to that is that the resistance in the Israeli public to these laws, to the exemption for Haredi men, to raising the age for reserves is so high that they're really concerned about their future politically if they go along with it. That's how unpopular it is. There's two mechanisms by which their political future could be ruptured. One, which I've talked about before, is primaries, which in the primaries, anyone who goes along with this law might suffer as a result. But there's a new threat that's even more acute. The latest polls show that if Naftali Bennett forms a party that runs in the elections, they will beat the Likud. They will form the next government. And I think that might actually happen. And either way, it's terrifying the Likud members. And they realize that one of the major reasons a more moderate and more responsible right-wing party is proving so popular is because of this army thing. It is absolutely turning into the most important wedge issue. The only thing I can compare it to in the United States is like Roe v. Wade. And it's probably more important even than that is. So a lot of the most politically astute members of the Likud are very hesitant to go along with a law that will give the Haredim what they want. And by the way, I don't believe Edelstein when he says this just reflects what's happening in the coalition. I think that he thinks that Netanyahu is weakening. He thinks that Netanyahu is on his way out. For years, he never had the courage to take on Netanyahu on anything important. And of course, he believes in what he's doing. There's no question. But just about every Israeli believes in this cause, except for the Haredi parties. But the reason he has the courage to do it is political. And this is part of a rebellion. I think he's joined forces with Gallant. And I think the front against Netanyahu in the Likud is just going to get wider because he looks increasingly weak and vulnerable. And the sharks smell blood in the water. So Edelstein seems to have become the most important person in the country. What are the Haredi parties doing? The Haredi parties are livid that Netanyahu hasn't delivered on this and that he can't control his coalition. And they feel that Netanyahu lied to them, misled them, and they are very unhappy with this coalition. Right now, they're staying in the coalition for two reasons. This is what Haredi people are telling the Israeli press. One, out of pure spite. They don't want to give Bagatz the satisfaction of destroying their government, so they're staying. And second, they're worried that if there are elections, things will get even worse. They see the same polls the Likud people are seeing. A new government with Bennett, Lapid, Gantz, and Lieberman is their worst nightmare. But the trouble is they've already lost so much in this government, how much worse can it be in another government? And there's no reason why they can't form a coalition with Bennett and try to get some of what they want. So I don't know how much longer that rationale will actually last. And meanwhile, the Haredi rabbis are not willing to accommodate any kind of concession whatsoever. They say that no Haredi man should go to the army, whether they study Torah or not, for reasons that are, again, spiteful and have nothing to do with the halacha or even politics at this point. I don't see how the government survives this schism. I think it's a question of when this house of cards falls apart, not if. Really, right now, it's can they limp along until the end of this session of Knesset? They're not going to survive the next session of Knesset. Can they limp along until the end of 2024? They're not going to survive 2025. I just don't see it. the problems that this coalition has are just mounting and mounting. I think that this particular issue, the military service issue, is the one that is going to kill this coalition. I think it's a cancer from which they cannot recover. I have only one question, so I will answer it. John Price Osagi asks, many analysts I follow on Twitter believe that by keeping Netzarim in Philadelphia and maybe creating other corridors and frequent raids in Gaza, a prolonged mowing the lawn strategy would push Hamas into irrelevance and be replaced by some mechanism that could be the PA but not necessarily. As there wasn't an official date for the end of the Second Intifada, there would be no official day of victory according to this strategy. That would be irrespective of the fate of the hostages and isolation on the global stage. Do you think this could be what Netanyahu is trying to achieve? So what you're describing here, John, is not a strategy. You're saying they will mow the lawn and eventually the government will be replaced. How will the government be replaced? This is magical thinking. How do you go from mowing the lawn to replacing the government? The answer is you don't. You have to actually have a plan to go in, take over Gaza, replace it with something else, and protect what you're replacing with. You're not going to degrade Hamas to the point where magically there's a new government. That doesn't work. And of course, if Israel continues bombing Hamas for the rest of eternity, the price that will have in terms of the hostages and the international standing, which you said, irrespective of, glossed over, would be incredibly high in order to have a strategy that doesn't achieve the goal that you're talking about. That's not a strategy. What's happening here is Netanyahu is doing something in lieu of the strategy so that he doesn't have to make decisions, painful decisions, like, is Israel going to form a military government? Is Israel going to move toward the two-state solution? Is Israel going to allow the Palestinian Authority in? Eventually, the Israeli army is not going to be able to operate in Gaza. The price internationally will be too high. So the strategy of continuing to mow the lawn forever is not a strategy. And even if that was a strategy, what it would lead to isn't a orderly government. It would lead to a failed state, Somalia style. And most governments in the world try to prevent failed states from being built next to their borders. They don't try to facilitate the creation of failed states on their borders because they are a major threat to security. So that's not a strategy. That's coping with lack of a strategy. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon at Shael Media. Consider listening to my history podcast, the History of the Land of Israel podcast. And yes, I've been lax on that, but I'm going to have a new episode soon about King Solomon and the temple coming out, I think by the end of this month. So I will see you here again very soon.